I got like my YouTube stuff open on the other side, trying to make sure that that's all healthy and going well. And it's been a while. I'll try to keep up with the chat, but we'll leave the questions for the end and just kind of wing it.
Live, right?
Yeah, we are. I'm just letting it fill up a little bit. What's going on, everybody? We're just going to wait a couple minutes, see if a few more people join before we get started. I'm just making sure everything's working because I'm always terrible at live streaming. So like a boomer trying to figure out how to work electronics when I try to live stream. It's awful.
Oh, man. Don't remind me.
Let me see. Okay. All right. So TechRally. What's up, dude? Jordan, what's going on? I want you to introduce yourself, tell the audience who you are, what you do, tell them about your channel and where you're working at now and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. My name is Alex and I am a front-end developer at Amazon. I started my coding journey back in 2015. And before that, I was just kind of working in the semiconductor industry for about a few years and then attended UC San Diego for college. It's kind of weird. I'm going backwards and now going forwards again. But in 2015, I decided to attend a coding bootcamp school in New York City, and I attended Flatiron School. I did that for about 3 months doing Ruby on Rails and pretty much only Ruby and Ruby on Rails, which is pretty crazy back then because
2015, yeah.
Back in 2015, like 6, 7, 10 years ago. Just kidding. But no, it just feels like such a long time ago because back then there was no real front end framework that was really dominant at that time. It was just either Angular, Backbone, or Ember. Yeah. But I digress. I studied Ruby on Rails, and after about a month or two, I was able to find a full-time gig in a agency. So there I did a lot of front-end development, back-end development, all of that jazz for about 8 months. And as much as I loved it, it came to a point where I wasn't really getting good at anything. And it was kind of like that show, Master of None. Yeah. I wasn't really getting good at something. So I wanted to focus on front-end. I was able to get a job as a front-end developer doing React. And actually, that's what got me hired as a front-end developer at my startup. Did that for about 5 years. And I was able to land a gig at Amazon afterwards as a front-end developer as well. Outside of work, I have a YouTube channel called TechRally. And this channel is dedicated to helping aspiring developers break into tech. So as someone that took a pretty non-traditional route into getting into software development, I like to provide tips and tricks, whether it's the interview process, networking, resume, portfolio reviews, all of that jazz kind of mixed into my YouTube channel to kind of give you my insight of things that I wish I knew when I was starting off. And especially because I just know how hard it is to land that first job. And, we've had some conversations offline as well about like, oh, what strategies did you use? What strategies did you feel like worked? And as much as like people have their own unique stories, there are a lot of common strategies that I feel like most people neglect. And as someone that is experienced, like you and I feel like we can kind of share a lot of our knowledge to our channels, respectively.
For sure. So that's Alex. That's TechRally. His channel's linked in the description down below if you want to check it out. Make sure you subscribe. Check out some of his videos. I also did an interview on his channel it's like 3-4 months ago, right? It was a while ago now.
Yeah.
So make sure to check him out. He's got a lot of good content on there. Now, my first question that I want to open up with, now you went to Flatiron and you said this was 5 years ago. So it was an in-person boot camp at the time. And I know those were really intense back then. I thought about joining one myself. It was basically a full-time job for 3 months. You go to the boot camp for 8 hours a day and you learn hands-on. You have teachers that help you and you work with other people, other students that are trying to learn how to code, and you build stuff and you get job ready. Boot camps are a lot different now because of everything that's been going on, and they've all kind of gone online. And I've kind of made a few videos talking about how boot camps are going crazy right now. And what was your experience like going to an in-person boot camp, and how was that for you? And did you get hired like right away after attending a boot camp?
Yeah, I mean there's a lot of things to unpack, and I actually interviewed a few of my classmates as well on my channel, and I always preface saying like, "Hey, this is our experience back in 2015, and take it with a grain of salt because a lot of things can change in 6 years." But for me, it was one of the best decisions of my life because I was learning how to code on the side, and much respect for people that can do it while having a full-time gig, but I knew I couldn't do it because my full-time job required me to be on call all the time. So it's just there was just never a dedicated time to really be able to learn how to code. And maybe I was just kind of coding maybe 1 or 2 hours a day, but I was spending like 10 to 12 hours at work. So it just wasn't feasible for me. And I just knew I needed to, number one, save my money because at that time, coding boot camps were about $12,000. So it's a bit cheaper than it was back then or now. But
They were also in person too.
they were also in
Which yeah.
person. So I think for me, I did a lot of research before I joined the coding bootcamp. So my coding bootcamp was in New York and I was living in Texas at the time. And I made it a trip to go to New York, go see the Big Apple and do all that stuff. But at the same time, I attended the campus and I was blown away because it was the in-person boot camp. I got to see the campus, which was just one floor, whatnot, and I got
Yeah.
to kind of shadow the classes as well and ask the CEO, the dean questions, and they were all like they were very open to answering any types of questions, and I really liked it because when I went, there was no overlapping classes. And that's very important to me because it made me feel like I was a priority when I graduated. And it wasn't going to be something like, hey, all right, you're done with the school. Get the heck out of here. And we'll see. Good luck on your coding journey.
Yeah, so they're not just trying to like churn and burn and get as many people out in and out of there as possible. Gotcha.
Yeah. So, I mean, my experience was amazing because I was able to, my teacher was actually the dean of Flatiron School. So he was that was the last year he taught a cohort. So we got the best of the best in a sense of like we got the OG teacher teaching the curriculum. And what I really loved about it then, which it doesn't actually happen now, was there was no such thing as grades or modules or you have to pass this module, otherwise you can't go to the next module. It was all about just, hey, do you understand this material? And if you don't, then you need to do a lot more work or you need to ask for help. And there were TAs that were always willing to help you out. And it was kind of like this no man left behind kind of mantra. So we're trying to, even if you were falling behind, people were trying to push you to keep going forward. And it was that mindset of like that togetherness and camaraderie that like, we got to get this done together. And fortunately enough, after the 3 months was done, I was able to land an internship actually first, which I don't really talk about too much because it was about a month.
Okay.
I applied for a job and I did really well. But unfortunately, my classmate did better than I did. And he got the job and there was only one position. And, of course, I was super happy for him. And, it is what it is.
It hurts a little.
It stung. But at the same time, I was genuinely really happy for him because I knew how smart he was, too. And it kind of was a blessing in disguise because a month later, that same company had another position open up for a junior role. And then they just hired me on the spot, no interview, because I already did the whole thing. So
nice.
So one month of just kind of just going through the internship grind. And then I was able to get that full-time job.
That's cool. So they kept you as a, a maybe if something opens up. Exactly. And then they hit you up and you got that job. That's pretty cool. So were you just kind of sick of your job that you were doing? Was that kind of your because that to have like a career going, right? You went to school, you were working, you were doing the thing. What made you just get tired of that and want to make a change? And how did that feel after attending school for so long to say like, oh, I'm going to go and do this and just completely change course? Because I know people who are older. How old were you at the time?
I think I was around 24-ish.
Okay, so you were still kind of young.
College, yeah.
Okay,
3 years out of college, yeah, at that time.
But someone who's older, like say you're in your 30s, you've already done your job for a few years, and now you're just kind of sick of it because it seems like that was your case. You were just a little bit younger, and you decided to just do that full on, like change. How was that? Because that sounds like it would be like really scary and like very uncertain, and like you're already like, well, I went to school and paid for a degree and did all this. Why would I change? So how was that transition, and what made you do it?
Yeah, so I'm originally from California. Go West Coast. I kind of wish I was on the West Coast now, so our times were a
Yeah,
little
it's
bit
so
more
late. You're in
aligned.
New York, so yeah.
But I moved when I moved to Texas. I didn't have any family there or anything, so it was there purely for the job. And I was working there for about 3 years, and it's not like some millennial. Oh, I wanted to change the world kind of thing. But what I saw was if I stayed at this company for 10 more years, I could kind of already see what my future looked like because it was that person across from me sitting in that cubicle who was in that manager role. And it's like, do I really want to work like 10 to 12 hours every day just to get to that seat over there?
To then work
To then work
12 to
even
14 hours, like to
yeah,
then work more
exactly.
hours, right?
And it was kind of weird to see your future, even though it wasn't actually you sitting there. And
Yeah, it's eerie, and I know the feeling
right.
very
And then
well. Yeah.
it just came to this point where I just said, "Hey, man, like I everything I studied back in school, I kind of forgot because after 3 4 years working at the company, you kind of understand how the company does the job, but it's very proprietary, and you don't actually have any applicable skills outside of work. So it was either stay in this industry or just start over, and hopefully this will be the next thing for you. So I actually studied for my LSATs and was thinking about being a lawyer potentially. And
Oh,
I experimented with other things here and there. Realized I don't like reading a lot and writing, so that's probably not a good sign for me to be a lawyer. And yeah, when I discovered coding through a YouTube channel called The New Boston, he's like one of the OG pre Brad Traversy type of YouTube videos. He was like the OG coding YouTuber, and I did like an Android tutorial with him, and it just felt like night and day compared to what I was doing at work and what I was doing when I was coding. And I just mathematically just calculated. I said, if I'm going to spend 33% of my time sleeping and another 60% of my time working, and that 10% like having the ability to code, it just doesn't make sense, right? So
yeah.
I say, hey, as now that I've saved enough money to give me enough runway for about 6 months, let's see what happens. And if I fail, then I could just go back to California and then see what's next, right? And I just thought it was just worth the risk. I didn't have any. I mean, maybe I was in a privileged position where I didn't have any kids or family to worry about, and it's well, at the worst comes to worst, I lived in New York for a few months, and I could say I did it. I guess
Yeah.
something off the bucket list.
It was an adventure for sure.
Yeah.
No, I looked into boot camps at the time, and they were in person, and it would definitely cross my mind. It was my circumstances were a little bit different. I had a job where I didn't have a career. I had a job. I went to work. I parked cars. I went home. I didn't have to worry about anything else. I worked my shift. If it was overtime, I'd make extra money, and it was not a lot of stress. And I had a lot of extra time because of my hours I worked and how many days a week I worked. So it was really like learning on my own was the best plan. But for some people, boot camps are a good choice. But the thing is, now with how boot camps have shifted, I kind of want your opinion. Do you think if you attended a boot camp, the same boot camp, let's say, because I know Flatiron right now is online, the value that you got from going in person, the being able to actually sit someone down or sit in front of someone and be like, help me with my code. Yeah, you have tools that you can do that remotely, but there is something about learning in person that's just different from learning online. Do you think that it would bring you as much value as it did when you attended, and in the format that it was when you attended? Because boot camps now you could still attend. I don't know their exact curriculums, and they're all different, but there's full boot camps that cost a lot of money, and they're pretty much the same thing as they were, but remote, or that's how they advertise them.
Right.
Now, how do you feel about that? Do you think that it would be something that could work for you, or just in general, or is the value of going in person where it's at?
I think nothing will ever beat the in-person experience. Personally, that's my opinion, where the value of being in person is just night and day, so much better for my personal learning. But everyone kind of works a little bit differently, and some people just prefer kind of working in that remote atmosphere. I personally hate it, but to answer your question, like, is it worth it? That's a really hard question to answer because I don't really fully know the curriculum and whatnot. And just because a boot camp is in person doesn't necessarily mean the quality is
it's
good.
Yeah, that's true. Good point.
Right.
Good point.
But in a pure black and white perspective, I would kind of lean towards the in-person because there's a little bit more accountability. You know, you're in a completely different environment where you're surrounded by your classmates. And well, I like to believe that when you're around people with that same energy, the same hunger, the same drive, then you want to work equally as hard. When I was attending my coding boot camp, I would also go into campus during the weekends, and it was never required, but I would always see the same 4 or 5 people of my classmates that were there because they just needed to get away from their house. And, you know, like, especially with remote for the past past year and a half, I feel that people just get cooped up, just staying in the same room, same environment. And yeah, I would lean towards the in-person if they can do it. But at this point, you know, I don't think we have that. I don't think current students have that luxury. So my recommendation would be to do as much research as you can. And like, remember how I talked about overlapping classes or who are your teachers? And I don't think you should just blindly sign up for a coding bootcamp thinking that you'll just get a job right away. You have to ask those really important questions. Like, if you're going to be investing like $20,000 into like a stock, you have to make sure it's not some kind of scammy penny stock, right? And just like coding boot camps, you have to know what their outcomes are. Do they get validated by SIR? Who are your teachers? And do you have a career service center? How long do you keep me accountable after I graduate? Do you just throw me away? Like, all of these things, and talking to students after they graduated, Reddit, all of these things are things that I always mention to make sure you do, because being a good software developer is not just about things just being handed to you. You got to do your research. You got to read the documentation. You got to read the fine print a little bit. And I'm not going to say that like all coding boot camps are bad, but I do definitely agree with you in a sense that I don't think it's the same experience that I got back in 2015 to now. Yeah.
Definitely. They're just a little more watered down, I would say. Real quick, so you got hired pretty like right out of your boot camp, and that's that's not always the case for a lot of people. The boot camp graduate that I worked with when at my first job, he also like got placed almost immediately, and not many people do. What would you say to someone who is trying to get a job and like trying to get that first job? What would you say were some of the things that helped you coming out of the boot camp that made you a better candidate than other people that may have been getting interviewed besides your buddy that got the job? Like, what made you a good candidate and what made you stand out from, because you went for 3 months, right? You had minimal experience in the grand scheme of things. The job market was a little different back then and whatnot, but still there's things that make people stand out. What do you think made you stand out?
So this is where I think the bootcamp really shined for me in 2015, was that dedicated attention, right? So outside of that whole let me teach you how to code team, there's a separate team that's establishing the networking and the connections. So they're building the relationships for you, and they know who you are by your first name. As you scale, that's going to be significantly harder, right? There's a little bit more expectation for you to figure it out versus the other way around. So a lot of times the coding bootcamp, all they said to me was just focus on the coding. We'll worry about the career service stuff later. And just like how a lot of YouTubers say networking is really important, I think I got really fortunate enough that the coding bootcamp did the networking for me. All I had to do was make sure my projects were on point. And then if they liked my projects, then they gave me the interview. And I think one of the biggest things that I've actually recently discovered, maybe the past 6 months, was that the way the career service team, even at Flatiron School, is a little bit different, where you just have a career coach, and the career coach is kind of just giving you kind of these generic advices of what you need to do, but there's no real connection in that regard. And I may be wrong, but it's not as personal as I imagined it when I was talking to some students. But I think that power of networking was really helpful for me, because I didn't really have to do it. It's like people were doing it for me. And then having a champion that will kind of vouch for you is just gonna like make your life significantly easier. And then after that, it's just really up to you to pass those interviews. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, networking is huge. It's one of the things I regret not doing sooner, just because of my own insecurities and being scared to go to a meetup when I felt like, I was a poser. And well, that's what it felt like. You're learning how to code for 2 months and you're going to go meet a bunch of like real developers. And you're just like, no, I'm not going in there. And then when I finally did, I was like, oh, this was great. I got hooked. I was finally like, I was around people that could help me and that were interested in the same thing that I was trying to learn. And it was really valuable to network. And I do agree that networking is really huge for anyone, bootcamp students or, self-taught developers or college graduates. Just try to get out there. And I know that, current circumstances suck because a lot of that stuff is also online, which takes away that, meeting people in person.
Right.
But do try to get out there. So your first gig was at an agency. For people who aren't familiar with what agencies are, they're usually, like digital agencies who take on work for small companies, large companies, depending on the agency and how big they are. They'll work and build websites or applications for people or companies that pay them. They're usually like third parties. A lot of the times they'll be contractors on work that, for instance, at my first job, we were the in-house developers. When we wanted to build something, we would hire out from an agency that would work with us, and then we would work alongside with them to kind of like supplement our team and help build the product, and they'd bounce and then we'd maintain it. And agency work, from like what you were saying, right? It's a lot of, you do a little bit of everything, and there's, I haven't done it myself, but I've worked with a lot of people, like I said, who have, and there is that benefit of you get to learn a bunch of stuff, but then that feeling you were getting where you were just all over the place and you weren't really good at one particular thing, but you knew a little bit of everything. Do you think that really helped you get that startup job? I'm assuming it did because the nature of startups. And since you worked at a startup for so long, what was the difference between like working at an agency versus working at a startup? Because I'm sure that a lot of the same stress is there, because agency work is really like, you got to get this done right now. Because usually that's how the clients are. And startups are the same in the sense, like, we got to get this out as soon as possible because we're trying to build, we're trying to scale, we're trying to get this product out there. So what were some of the differences, and what were some of like the pros and cons and the things you liked and disliked about both?
Right. I think one of the cons of working at an agency is that you never really get to see the finished product. You kind of work on a feature, and then you finish the contract, and then you move on to the next contract. So you kind of feel somewhat like a mercenary. And he's like, hey, finish this. Okay, done. After 2 or 3 months of having some kind of meaningful relationship with the designer or the other developers on the team, and it's like, okay, cool. Like, maybe we'll grab a beer.
Yeah. And the project, you go out for dinner, and if you actually come and work in house with the other people.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, you're right. Mercenary. That's like the most badass way I've ever heard.
Yeah, and then it's just like a debt for hire, basically.
Mercenary code.
Yeah, that was kind of one of the cons. I mean, you still had coworkers that worked in the agency with you, but it's just not the same, right? And I think one thing with the startup, especially because I stayed there for about 5 years, a lot of those developers are currently still my friends, right? And I would say that it was a little hard for me to kind of make that transition from coworkers to friends. But after you worked there for about 5 years, it's inevitable you're going to grab a few beers and whatever, and you kind of are building somewhat of a meaningful product in a sense that you've committed many, many years to the same application over and over again. So in some regards, one of the pros was that you get to see at a very, very long duration of time, hey, what technical decisions and choices did we make that were good, and what technical choices and decisions we made were not the smartest things to do at the time, right? And sometimes people always complain about tech debt, but you try to build the best you can with the given information that you have at that moment. But it's crazy to see how an app can totally evolve based on new investors coming in. And working at a startup really exposed me to not just coding and how to be a better developer, but it kind of exposed me to, what does it mean when a company goes from Series A to Series B? And what does it mean when we actually get funding? And what are my shares actually? What are the values of my shares? All of these little things that maybe when you're at an agency, you don't really think about, because it's just like, hey, build this, hey, build that. I would say that I like working at a startup gave me a lot more purpose on what the product actually was, versus at an agency it might just be like just
Code for
code.
hire. Yeah, code for hire. That's
Just
pretty
code.
much it. Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you. I dabbled with the idea of like doing agency work, because you know that you often get contacted by recruiters for agency work, or I have in web dev and front end development, which is kind of like what I do. You'll always get those agency jobs, and it's like, oh, it sounds fun. You work on different stuff. You know, you get to do a little React, a little Vue, a little Angular, and but yeah, at the end of the day, I guess you don't have your code baby, right? You don't have
Right.
that product that you've built, that you're a part of, that you can stand next to and say like, hey, this is what our team built. It's more like, you know, you're the people that come on and help, and never to be heard from again, unless another project comes back or something like that you could be hired for. So
yeah, and it definitely keeps you on your toes when working at an agency. I mean, I have to admit, when I was at a startup, since you're so familiar with the code base, I could kind of coast my way to finishing out a feature. But when you're at an agency, you're kind of always under the gun of new code bases, trying to understand that their team's best practices and trying to adjust in that fashion if you're really up for that high pace. And that's something that maybe if you're a newer developer, it might be good for you, because you're just learning so much and getting paid at the same time.
yeah.
So I have no regrets about joining an agency. If anything, it probably made me a better developer, and it gave me the most exposure to so many different things that I finally was able to figure out what I actually enjoyed about coding, versus maybe I was forced to do just one thing and this is all I know.
Nice. Yeah, I could only imagine what it would be like as having an agency job as your first job, because one of the things that always gets me, that blew me away, and even though I had been in a large code base before, like I got my feet wet with the little volunteer gig I did, and I looked at some big projects on GitHub, but when I actually had to work in a large project and learn how everything worked, you know, because I was a full stack developer at my first job, even though I was more front end, I learned all the back end, front end, and how everything worked together. And man, the first 3 months of doing that job and having to just look through all that code and figure out how you wire everything up was just so overwhelming for me. But by the end of, you know, my 2 years there, I could probably, you know, build a component from back to front in our application with, you know, my eyes closed, because I knew everything and I knew how everything was. Like you said, you can kind of autopilot on some things. Of course, you come across some problems that may be difficult, but if it's just like pure like CRUD functionality on your application, that's just like,
Right.
you can pretty much do it blindfolded at that point once you know a code base. But when you don't, it's just like, geez. So yeah, being a junior dev and going, you know, from code base to code base, that must have been a little overwhelming. I would think.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like I was drowning, but in some regards, I don't know, maybe that's the best way to learn.
yeah, sink or swim, right? Get thrown in the deep end.
Yeah.
And really it is. And it's funny that you said that, because at my current job, when I started there a couple of years ago, when they gave me my first really hard task, because I got hired on as like front end UI developer, and that stuff is for the most part easy mode for me. But when they gave me a real, you know, Spring Boot full stack task that my lead dev thought it would take me a couple months, and I was like, yeah, right, a couple months. But it was like I built entire functionality from setting up the database to, you know, all the entities in Spring and like everything. It ended up taking longer than his predicted time, and it was just complete like imposter syndrome the whole way through. I was like, how have I been doing this for so long and I feel like I don't know anything? And I had to figure all this stuff out. And then when I did, it's helped me so much. Now, you know, the next task after that one was easy mode, because I got thrown in the deep end. I figured everything out. And then when it came around to having to hook something up, I was like, oh, I just did this. And now, you know, things are starting to coast and be a little bit more autopilot when it comes to that. But when I first had to like hook everything up in my first big task at my current job, it was overwhelming. And that was with 2 years of experience, because it was just, I never worked in Angular. I never worked with Spring Boot. I didn't know any of that stuff. I was just learning SQL, never worked with SQL before, because we used a JCR in my first job. And it was just, it was a lot to take in, and a bit of a hit to the ego. And when you think you know what you're doing. And
Yeah, I
happens.
mean, it's inevitable. I mean, especially if you join a company that has a lot of different services and all of those things, you can't be a expert at everything. And I've definitely experienced that as well. And I don't know. I wish there was a better way for, at maybe in your situation, if there was someone that had that experience and kind of pair with you at least an hour or two a day, just so you aren't crazy and building this in a like spaghetti code way, or like Legos are so off piece or whatever, right? Just so you could get that sanity check saying that, hey, you are on the right road versus, hey, just
Yeah.
figure it out, read
No,
documentation.
I had my hand held quite a bit. What got me was observables. I don't know if you work
Oh,
with
yeah.
observables and RxJS and all
Yeah.
that. And I never
Oh, no.
never touched any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I went like, just hooked up all kinds of observable stuff in Angular, and it was just, yeah, I was trying to figure out, how they work, what streams are, what the different methods that they have for like tap, pipe, concat map, and like what all the differences are. And it was a lot to take in. And now I get that stuff. I still get, I have a little hard time with some of it, but now it's like totally like day and night from how,
Oh man, you're gonna have to
when I
teach me,
first got
because
into
I
it.
tried learning RxJS observable stuff, and I was like, "What the heck is this? This is
Dude,
so different way of thinking."
it's great to handle a lot of the async stuff,
Yeah,
with JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever you're working with, where you're using like RxJS, but it is very confusing at
yeah.
first, and just trying to figure that all out, and
I
how.
like how they were. I remember when I was trying to learn it just for fun. They always use these yellow balls or something to like show you,
To show
hey,
you the
you
different
move this.
streams of like when you could get the
Exactly.
data, or like when it's done completing, so you can get it here.
I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
this is okay, okay, and then they're like, okay, now build Facebook or something. I'm like,
Yeah.
what?
Well, my lead dev, he did a good way of explaining it. And we're going off topic
Yeah,
for
sorry.
observables, but he explained it as like a stream, and then like how the different methods did certain things in the stream. Like, the stream is constantly moving, but then you do a tap here. So you go off the side of the stream, you do your side effect, and then you come back in the stream, and then you do your next one. And I still, you can obviously tell I don't know it well enough, because I can't explain it well enough. And that's usually a sign, but I know it a lot better than I did when I got that
Hey, you
first
know more
task.
than I do, so that I was just saying, I was just showing you the colors of the balls in the diagram, but
So, all right. So you did agency work for 8 months, and then you worked at a startup for 5 years.
yeah.
And startup life can be hard. Did you ever, at any time, face like, hey, we might not get funding, I might not have a job tomorrow? Or were you at kind of like an established startup that already had funding when you went into it? Like, how was that experience? Because I've heard a lot of crazy horror stories about startups. I've heard people show up and doors are closed and there's no last paycheck, and you're if you want it, you're probably going to have to go to court, because it happens. I mean, not all the time. That may be, an extremely rare case, but it does happen where they just
Right.
lose funding and your job's done and you have to go find a new one. How was it for you in that regard? Was it pretty stable?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think I was fortunate enough to be at a company that was very conservative with their money. So we didn't have those, I don't know, weekly lunches or, free coffee
Keg,
Friday
keg in the
or
refrigerator, stocked all the time.
yeah, exactly. I mean, coffee was free, but you know what I mean. The refrigerator didn't have all that, the nice amenities or all that stuff, because uh, I personally didn't care for that, to be honest, because as long as I had a paycheck that was coming in and I could code, that was the most important thing. So I personally really like the fact how conservative my old company was with their cash flow, and it was something that my CEO and stuff were like, they would share with me, because I think I was maybe like the 20th employee or something. So I felt comfortable with kind of at least financially where things were going, so I could just focus on what I was good at, which was coding. But yeah, I mean, I've heard some horror stories as well, and I think you need to probably just do your research. I didn't do any of my research beforehand before getting the job. But knowing what I know now about how startups 90% fail and all of that jazz, I want to make sure I know what I'm getting myself into. Like, what was your most recent funding like? And I think you could do all that research on TechCrunch or Crunchbase. So yeah, definitely check those out. Make sure you're not
See, and
joining a sinking ship.
that's something that I would have zero clue about. I honestly have stayed away from startups just because of a lot of the stories I've heard and a lot of that uncertainty that I did apply for one before I moved to Washington while I was still in Vegas, but it's just always in the back of my head. Like I got kids. I can't just not have a job, next week if it just comes down to it without any prep. So it's not really a situation that I'd want to put myself in. And you always hear like startups are like for younger people and the culture too. I can kick it, but I don't want beer in the fridge all day either, because I'll be an alcoholic by noon. I'll be wasted, and you won't want to see the code I'll be committing at that point. So, and a lot of that stuff I think is gimmicky and a way to kind of like trap people in the office or lure people in with how cool we are and how cool our culture is here. There's all this expensive food, and like you said, eventually that well runs dry, and if they use their funding on a lot of those things, and they can actually grow the business, which at the end of the day, that's where most of your money is going to come from if it actually does take off and you have a lot of shares in it and whatnot. So I don't know. I feel like startup culture wouldn't be for me. Would you recommend it for someone that was maybe, has a kid, a little bit older, family, doesn't want to put in the extra hours or work on the weekends to try to help out? Because also that happens a lot in startups. And did that happen to you? Would you recommend it to older people? And was it like work-life balance any good for you at your startup?
Yeah, in the beginning, it was a lot of hours, but I would say it was just more about ramp up. And also we were trying to release our new application out, version 2 of our application. But after a while, there was some stability. Like, we released the application. Now we're kind of either on maintenance mode or adding new features. And I would highly recommend anyone that, even regardless of kid or no kid, to check out a startup, because you're kind of wearing a lot of different hats and you're very involved. You could potentially be very involved in the process flow as much as you want, or not as involved as you want. It really depends on the startup. The startup that I was in, I got a lot of autonomy to build my component library, build our team's component library using React. I worked on a lot of like high exposure projects, and maybe someone at my level at that time, because I only did the agency for about 6 months, I wouldn't have those opportunities maybe working at a bigger company, because there's a lot more like formality and structure where they say, oh, actually the first three to 6 months, you need to do some training, and then you go through training, and then after that, it's like, oh, we want you to do some bug fixes. But when you're working at a startup, you're kind of working, I would think that you're more working on features rather than just, hey, can you fix this? Can you do this ticket that no one wants to do? Right.
Here you go, junior. Here you go, new guy.
Yeah. It seems like there's either one of two routes juniors either go to. They somehow become the senior developer of their team because they're the only developer, or they just end up doing bug bashing. But either way, I personally love the startup because it really elevated my coding skills, because I was giving so many opportunities to try different projects. And I think that was really clutch for me. And that's why it kind of made me more marketable at the end.
On that note, would you say that you had good mentors at the startup? Because you said you had like a lot of freedom and more responsibility than you would have in other circumstances. Did you have the mentorship that helped you make sure that you weren't like making really rookie mistakes and stuff? Because 6 months, I mean, I think of myself after having a year and a half of experience, and I still felt like if they just gave me a code base and said, this is yours, I would have probably ended up destroying it. Did you still have good guidance as a junior at a startup, or were you just kind of doing your own thing and figuring stuff out on your own?
Yeah. So I feel like doing the agency, as much as I personally didn't really like my experience with my mentor or my the guy who was kind of helping me code, he was very smart but very difficult to work with.
Mm.
And I was actually learning a lot without realizing how much I learned. And I'm a big believer of it's not about the time, it's about what you do with it, right? And when I was doing in those 6 months, I was still treating my 6 months of work like a coding boot camp. And I had the luxury to do it because I was in New York City. And I mean, I met more people afterwards, but more or less, I was spending weekends. And I would say that the first 2 years out of a coding boot camp, I was still treating it like a coding boot camp. I
Like
was
just
coding
every
all
day.
the time, and it is maybe it's not. I definitely know it's not sustainable to do for the long term, but for me, it was about catching
Ah,
up to the industry
yeah.
basically, and I felt somewhat confident in those 6 months. I felt confident when I landed that startup job and I was working with senior developers. I was like, hey, I'm doing just as much as work as they are. And I realized how much I learned during those 6 months. And if anything, that really gave me a lot more confidence in my skills and my ability to read documentation and my ability to, just search for things and not be complacent with my technical skills really gave me that edge over a lot of people that might be around the same time frame of learning that I did. It's just what you do with that time is super important in my opinion.
I agree. I honestly think it's unhealthy because I did the same thing.
Mhm.
And like you said, it's not sustainable. And I probably did it. It was weird, right? Because you get your first job and then you think that's like when you're gonna chill. But or
Mhm.
maybe some people do. But me, I was like, oh shit, now I gotta prove myself, right? Like
Mhm.
that was my mentality. My
Right.
mentality was like, I'm self-taught. These guys gave me a chance to join their development team. They saw something in me. I was like, I can't let them down. So I went on this crazy, like, I'm going to learn everything in our stack.
Mhm.
I am going to build extra side projects in the stuff that I need to use at work because I want to learn it on my free time so I can get better at my job. Then that kind of shifted into like taking that work home. Sorry, I hit my mic. Then that kind of shifted into like taking that work home and then doing more work at home and learning more. And then like after a year of at my first job, I felt like I had to chill because I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
My wife was getting upset and it was just like, hey, you're working too much. And I do believe that helped me play catch up, like you said. And that was kind of the same mindset. I felt that I went from, okay, now I have almost a year of learning on my own and I have a year of professional experience, but the amount of time and energy and effort and learning and building that I put in those 2 years, I feel like it's more like closer to 4 years. And I know what you mean. I've come across some senior level developers where it's just like, I was like, I shouldn't know this and you should,
Yeah.
because I still don't consider myself, I hardly consider myself mid-level because my own insecurities and imposter syndrome that I can't get over. But it's funny because I've been part of the interview process and I've seen some of the talent that comes in. And then when you actually start seeing what's out there, you'd be surprised that there are people who have been doing it for a long time, but they're just not at the same level as some other people who are just more obsessed with learning the stuff and
Right.
catch up eventually. And you do see that sometimes out there in the industry.
Right. And there are always going to be people smarter than you, and there are going to be people not as smart as you, right? But it's up to you to decide how much time you want to invest in this. And to me, and maybe it's because I lived in New York where it's super expensive, and making more money is not about wow, I'm rich. It's about oh wow, I can live in
Survival.
an apartment with like direct sunlight. So this is why I'm gonna study as much as I can for the first 2 years because I don't want to live in this like crappy apartment anymore. So it's just like upgrading my life to normalcy basically.
Yeah.
And that's kind of to be honest, that was my motivation. It was like I need to make more money. And I wasn't making the most money at my first job. I mean, and it wasn't like I was living on the streets or anything, but I just knew that if I wanted to just get to that next level, even financially, I had to have the skills to back it up, right? And I always get motivated by, like even like boxers like Floyd Mayweather, even though they're all rich, he works like he's broke. And I made like a video why I code like I'm broke because you just as great as my, my positions have been with the agencies and all of those things, like they could fire you anytime, right? To your point, they could fire you the next week. So what are you going to do, right? Like you have to make sure the skills that you have is easily translatable to, okay, I could just get this new job. Yeah, you may fail a few interviews and whatnot, but if you've been coasting the whole time and not learning anything, and they fire you, maybe they fired you for a good reason.
Yeah.
Second, oh my God, like you're gonna fail all these interviews and you're gonna ask yourself, what was I doing with all this spare time that I had, right? So
No, it's a good point.
yeah.
I definitely feel like and not like, tooting my own horn, but I do feel like I have reached a point where I don't have to worry about like finding a job. I've gotten to the point where dude, there's so much recruiter spam and just, you know how it is. Once you've got like a certain amount of time under your belt, again, you go to some interviews, like algorithms suck for me. Like don't ask me to do algorithms. I'll probably fail, but I know that I can do well in interviews if they ask me the right questions on the stack that I've worked with, the stack that I worked with previously. I know that I can do well in interviews. I know that I can get a job. I've done it already a couple times, and now it gets easier as you get more experience. I am assuming that. I don't know.
Right.
I could be wrong,
Right.
but it is a good feeling to have that. Like you said, like I know that if my job let me go tomorrow, it might take a month or two, and I'm responsible enough to have that money saved where I can pay for that if that happened. But I know that I can get a job almost. I would say immediately, but
Right.
markets are different, and I might have to relocate, but I never have to worry about not being able to support myself because of learning how to code and doing it for as long as I've had now.
You also got your
It's a
YouTube
nice
channel,
feeling.
so we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, which is doing great. And honestly, like I don't know, man. I made that video saying that if they try to make me go back to the office, I don't know. I can't say too much. I don't think anybody really watches my channel from my job. I haven't had the discussion yet, but I really don't want to go back to the office. And
time, man.
we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe I become a full-time YouTuber.
Yeah, we'll see. But I mean, one thing I want to emphasize is that the reason I'm talking about this hustle and the grind and working really, really hard. But the reason why I think that's so important, at least in the beginning, is the catch-up period. But I do have to admit, after a certain point, even at my startup, because I was there for 5 years, I would say about year 3, 4, that was one of the few times where I felt like I could just get out of that deep end and finally breathe, right? I don't have to be constantly coding till like 8 or 10 p.m. I could just do my normal like 9 to 5, but I really put in that upfront work to get to where I was. And then I said, okay, now I could kind of relax a little bit and just do my job and have a life outside of work. And then, just enjoy coding while I can. So I think that's one thing I want to emphasize as well.
Yeah, and that balance, it takes some time to get. Like I can't sit here and preach like work-life balance. I've done the wrong things a lot. I've put in the extra hours. I'll tell people don't work on your free time. I've done it. Everybody's done it. But the truth is that walk that line carefully, because I've seen people burn out. I've burned out. I know how bad it can get to where you just hate your job. There's nothing that can change it, and you just want out. And eventually, if you code too much, if all you do is code all the time, you're going to end up hating it. And honestly, I started a channel about talking about learning how to code, but I haven't done much coding on it because, dude, I code 8-9 hours a day. Like I'm not trying to come home and build stuff too. Like if I was, unemployed, I would probably build stuff and do those things, but I just don't have it in me. I don't have that drive. If it would have been 3 years ago, I would have no problem just flipped on a camera while I'm doing my thing, because that's all I did.
I cannot code on my YouTube channel. It's just I tried, and it's just I do not want to code after coding.
So here's the big thing, right? Now we know you went to an in-person bootcamp, so that's a little bit different. The main event, right? Because I put it in the title because I wanted to make it clickbaity, and it's a true story, right? You are working at Fang, and many people aspire to become Fang developers, right? It's always like, I want to work at one of the top companies. That's like, it's a badge of honor. And a lot of the times it's harder for like bootcamp graduates, or in my mind, I think it is harder for a bootcamp graduate or a self-taught developer to actually land that job. And I mean, you went in with a lot of experience, but what made you want to go Fang and try to apply for it and try to go through that grind of landing a job at one of these big companies? And you work at Amazon, and I know that their hiring process is probably pretty intense. So what made you want to go through that and actually work there?
To be honest, I actually didn't apply there. They reached out to me, and it was something that I saw and I ignored while I was actively looking.
Go figure, right?
Because as much as I like to believe on my own skills, I didn't feel like I was ready for that kind of rigorous interview, kind of similar to the data structures and algorithms. I didn't want to do it because I knew how much work was going to be involved for it. And I was interviewing already with a bunch of different startups. And funny enough, all of those startups rejected me. And some of them, I made it to the final round. And I just felt like there was like this little weird thing that they were just being really picky about. And maybe that's a little bit more... They do that because I'm an experienced developer and they know what they are looking for, I guess. But at a certain point, after a few rejections, I said, okay, you know what? Might as well just respond to this and see what happens. And things lucked out, and I was able to get an interview with someone, and I did the whole technical interviews. And yeah, that flow just happened because in some regards, I would like to believe that all of the failures kind of led to this success, because it wasn't just pure technical skills that got me screwed for not getting those jobs. There were just soft skills that I didn't really prepare myself for. I just didn't have good stories to talk about. I was just like, hey, as long as I'm technically solid, then you'll hire me, right? But there's just so many layers to it that I didn't know. And I said, hey, why not? At the worst case, they just reject me, and then I could just apply somewhere else. And I could tell myself, hey, like, I never really wanted to work here anyway, kind of mindset. So
yeah, so it'd be like, I didn't want that job.
Yeah, I didn't want that job anyway. If I got rejected, that's how I felt up with all the other companies that rejected me. But no, I think I just got really lucky in a sense that I was exposed to a lot of companies in the beginnings, got rejected, and just started iterating. And eventually, when I got to Amazon, I knew that I had to prepare like crazy. And maybe if I was interviewing at Amazon as one of my first companies, I wouldn't prepare at all. And then completely we would have bombed it. Yeah.
That's it's so funny because that's one of the reasons why I tell people to start interviewing like right away.
Right.
Because or applying, I'm sorry. So then that way they could potentially get interviews sooner, because you're very unlikely to land your first job, first interview like that doesn't really happen. That's a lot of luck that's involved. You're going to get phone interviews or phone screenings that you're going to bomb, which I have. You're going to get interviews where you might come in and not do well. My first job, I got it through a recruiter, but I still did a lot of phone interviews for other jobs. But my second job, I went through the interview process, and it was months, and I had 2 years of experience. And it was, I'd do well, I'd get to a certain point, and it was just like, you're not technical enough, or, you're not a good fit. Companies that I didn't do well for would then call me back months later and then ask me to come in because whoever the candidate that did better than I did fell through. And I actually ended up getting like a job in that manner, where they phone interview, failed it. I know that I rubbed the hiring manager the wrong way with some of my responses to the questions he had. And then like 2 months later, or a month and a half later or so, they called me back and they're like, hey, they sent me the rejection email. Like, it was like, I got the, hey, sorry, we're going to go with somebody else. And then they retracted it and they were like, hey, on second thought, if you want to come in, and I know what it was. I was like, all right, cool. And I ended up like acing that interview. Like, I got an offer like pretty much on the spot. They offered me a job, and then we worked out the negotiations of the salary afterwards. But they basically were like, hey, we need you to meet the hiring manager before, like the director, before you go, because we don't want to have to make you come back. And I was like, that's funny, because I failed the phone interview the first time around. So
you just never know, honestly.
You don't.
Yeah, Amazon or not. Yeah.
The practice is key. And that's, I guess I came back around to that. That's what I was trying to get to, is that you don't know how many questions you'll get that are like the same generic interview questions, because you know what a lot of people do when they're hiring. They go on Google and they Google like, what are questions that I should ask a front end developer for an interview? Just like front end developers go and Google the same thing. So sometimes you'll get the same exact question. And I've had it happen where I got asked about what's the block model on web, right? Like that's super basic, you know, or the box model, you know, the border, padding, margin, all of that. And I failed it like the first time I got asked that question, but then at the job that I'm working at now, they asked me that same question and I aced it, because when I failed it the first time, I went home and I had a list of things that I knew that I failed that they asked me, and I Googled all of them, and I was like, if they ever ask me this again, I will not miss it. And you know, that practice of getting that same question later on really helped a lot with the interview. So try to apply an interview as soon as you can. What are some tips that you would give people right now that are looking to learn how to code, maybe thinking about going to boot camp, trying to do self-taught? Like, what would you do now, or what would you recommend for someone who is, you know, just coming into it now that you're an experienced developer and whatnot? What would you tell someone?
Right. I'll answer that question, but I think the one thing I want to emphasize, at least with interview processing in general too, is try not to just memorize how to solve a problem. For me, what I found most beneficial, and maybe it's coming with experience, is try to just understand the fundamentals and then see what you can do with those fundamentals and apply to the question that they're asking you. And what I mean by that is like how to manipulate an array, like what functions are you going to use, like a map or a reduce or for each. All of those things are things you should just understand in the back of your head, because they might ask you questions that you're like, oh, I know I have to use a for each here because of this. Like, there's so many different ways to solve a problem that there's no way you could cram all of that information. And even for like the Amazon interviews or all my other interviews, I try not to memorize anything. Like when I was studying for Leak Code, I just did a lot of easy to mediums. And then on the hard ones, if it was so hard that I was like, regardless of me solving this problem and memorizing it, there's no way I could rememorize this if they asked me this. So like, I just kind of just said, hey, if they ask me this, then it is what it is. I'm just not gonna, I'll try my best. And if I don't get it, that's fine. Like I just took the hit that way. But yeah, I think that I just wanted to mention that part of at least with the interview process, because I think it's super important to understand that you have to be a problem solver, not necessarily like a problem memorizer. And that's another thing with like self-taught or just learning how to code. I think what I find with coding a little bit different, and maybe this is my own personal experience, is like the way I learn, I have a hard time memorizing things. That's why I was really bad at like history and biology and maybe even like English literature stuff, because I just had a really hard time getting an exam that required me to read like 100 pages of text only to ask me a question on like paragraph 3 on page 27 or something, right? I'm like, oh my God, like just tell me the SparkNotes version of something, right? And what I liked about coding is that it just gives you a bunch of utility tools to figure out a problem, right?
Yep.
And if I had to compare it to, again, it's just like, here, I'll give you a hammer, a screwdriver, a bunch of nails, and whatever. Like, make me a table. Okay, now that you made a table, now make me a chair, right? It's like not everyone's process is going to be the same, but you know that you need to use these tools to build it. So that's how I kind of like to approach coding, is this idea that there's no like manual that's going to make you a software developer, or a certificate that says, hey, you are a software developer. It's what you're able to do with the tools that you have, which are your hands, your keyboard, and your compiler, basically. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, but that's kind of like a strategy of learning how to code. But yeah, like, I mean, I think you've kind of, in your videos, you've pretty much nailed it with the free code camp, the Odin project, the free routes. And then if you do decide to do a coding bootcamp school, I think it's also good to always do your due diligence. See if you could shadow a class. I think that would be awesome. Just to see if you are like compatible with that kind of teaching style. Ask those hard questions, because if you're going to be paying $15,000 to $30,000, you best believe you're putting your money in the right places, right? So yeah.
Yep, you gotta, even when you're like applying for a job and you make it
Hmm.
through like the interview process, and you start getting to those questions about like, what's the work-life balance here?
Mm.
What's your coding process like? Is there
Hmm.
code review? Do
Their
you
code
do do
reviews,
you do pair programming? Do you do all these things? How much are you paying?
how much
Like,
are you paying? Yeah,
yeah,
that's an
how
important one
much are
too.
you paid? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of there's a lot of things that when you're looking for a job or looking for a boot camp, like, don't be scared to ask the questions that you really need to know the answers for, to
Hmm.
determine whether or not it's something that you really want, whether it be a job or a boot camp. Because there's a lot of fine print, and if you don't get that stuff up front, you might sign up for something that you're not going to be happy with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I know that I've been kind of looking at the chat. I think somebody was kind of like saying that I wasn't paying attention to the chat, and I mean, I've been glancing at it, but I'm not watching it because we were gonna wait till the end of the live stream to do some Q&As, and I think that we've covered a lot. Was there
Right.
anything particular that you wanted to talk about, that you want to plug, that you want to mention, that, like, just anything that you want to say to people before we open it up for a few questions from the audience?
No, nothing in particular. I mean, maybe, more if you want to talk more about the Amazon stuff, but in general, no, I think I answered a lot. I would say at least working at Amazon is just it's very different from what was at my startup, but it's very good for me because I think one thing I might have learned after working at a company for 5 years is maybe I should have left a little bit earlier, because you get that kind of like that complacency with uh, understanding the whole code base and all of that stuff. And while I said that I always felt like I was drowning in the beginning, I started like kind of treading to like getting out of the pool, basically, just like just so
On
in the
lifeguard
sun.
duty, just watching from
Yeah,
from the
exactly.
outside.
So
Yeah,
I mean, I knew what I got. I don't want to say I got so good at it, but I got good enough in the front end that whenever I got, people ask me, "Oh, are you interested in doing back end stuff?" I was like, "Nah, I'm good."
like
Because
like you kind of were like, no, this is my thing. I'm
yeah,
gonna
this
do
is my
this.
thing. This is my thing. But I would say always have like this curious mind, because I think that's how I've been approaching at least my time at Amazon. And I've been given, like, my title is front end, but I've been given a lot of opportunities to work in like AWS. And
That's
maybe the
cool.
old Alex would have just been like, nah, this is not my thing. I work in React and Webpack. But I'm so glad that I'm more open to it, because it's sparking my interests again of coding in general. And yeah, I have to admit, it kind of reminds me of my old times where like the long hours again. But
Really.
it's, in some ways I feel like I'm becoming a better developer. So I think ultimately, putting in the extra hours, you have to, the main priority should be on your own skills and making yourself more marketable. And I like to believe that learning AWS will make me more marketable.
So what, I guess, what are some things that just completely stand out that are just like totally different from the startup to like Amazon now? Is it process? Is it just, I'm not really going to go into the stack that you're using, but are
Right.
there any things that like really stand out to you that you're like, oh wow, we did not do this at the startup, and we were like, this was something we should have been doing that this big company does?
Right. I think so. It might sound kind of like religious or something, but Amazon believes in this 14 leadership principles. And the first one is customer obsession. And a lot of times I thought, people would be like, oh, that's just kind of like, you just need it for the interview. But I would really argue that a lot of the developers, the team, everyone kind of really revolves around these like principles. And I think they're really good principles in a sense that you're not just coding for the sake of coding. And that's kind of what, you remember how I was like, you're mercenary, just give me the code and I'll read the code.
Yeah.
Like, there needs to be some kind of understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. And on top of being around a lot of smart developers and very capable developers, it's been kind of, one of those like small fish in a big pond mindset, which I love in a sense, because I love being around just very technically smart people. But on top of that, at least within my team, everyone's been super nice. So at startups, I don't know, maybe there's this tendency of like, hey, I'm the smartest guy here, and like, you follow my lead or else kind of mentality. Like,
Don't you ever question me or
don't you
make
ever
a
question
comment
me? I
on
came
code
from
review
here,
about
kind of.
something I did.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so much to deal with those kind of personalities. And there's a element of coding and being a software developer that we didn't really talk about. What was like the whole personalities of software developers, which can be either very good or very bad depending on the team you're joining, like the toxic developer. But so far, it's been really good for me, being around not only just really smart developers, but people that are just very willing to help. And I need a lot of help right now because, I mean, I'm only 3.5 months into Amazon. So yeah.
So you mentioned something that got me thinking about, like, when you were at the startup, you didn't really want to take on, the extra back end stuff, or you were like,
Yeah.
you were pretty happy doing the front end thing, and now you're kind of a little more eager to learn. Do you think that's just because of the nature of such a big company that's tech focused, having more resources for you to learn rather than having you learn back end just so you can do more work? They're actually teaching you. They want to teach you back end so you can grow as a developer, and then to maybe move up the ladder or move up to a full stack position. Because at a startup, you learn back end. Well, now you're a full stack developer, and you're doing front end and back end. Where at Amazon or at a bigger company, I'm assuming that you start learning those things, and then that bumps you up the next level, or it bumps you up to the next title or the next position when it opens up, or whatnot. And
Right.
what led you to wanting that more now this time around?
I think it's about the value for me. Again, value for myself and my technical skills. The backend that we were using at the startup was kind of using a very odd way of Ruby on Rails with Neo4j database. So personally, I just didn't find those skills very marketable.
Ruby's kind of dying for sure. It was
Right.
really
I mean,
big back like when you were learning, but it's
yeah.
becoming legacy because you don't see a lot of new startups and apps using Ruby
Right.
anymore,
But I
really.
mean, there are still a lot of companies using it, but the way we were using it was so just out of the
Like not how it's
ordinary.
supposed to be done.
Yeah, we were using Ruby on like a very functional way, and it was just so hard to get anything spinning up because of the way it was made. And on top of that, we were using Neo4j, which is like not a very big database compared to like Postgres and all that stuff. So like knowing those things, I didn't think would really help me in the long run. So I never found value in it. But I mean, like learning AWS, I mean, like, wow, I'm pretty sure a lot of companies use it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's good to know. So I like, even at Amazon, I love, of course, it's love being around smart people and everything. But ultimately, I think my true like motivation on why I do the things that I do is like, how do I make myself more marketable? How do I make myself more money? Or, how do I become a better developer essentially? And if that's aligned, if my personal goals are aligned with the company goals, then that's
Then
perfect.
it's a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
And then it's definitely something that piques your best interest. And at the
Exactly.
end of the day, it's the best interest for the company too, because you
Exactly.
grow and you learn more. And then eventually when it's time for that position that's needed and you're the guy, it just works out that way. And that's something I appreciate about where I work at now. I work for the public sector. I'm not at a FAANG or anything, but I'm lucky to have seen how bad it could be working at like a big casino corporation, Fortune 500 company, as a developer, and then moving into a team that is actually focused on tech and focused, like I work in IT this time. I don't work in marketing. It's different. Our directors and all the higher ups in my department were all developers at one point in time. They're actually the developers that built the application that we're modernizing now, which is kind of cool. So there's the respect for the process. There's the understanding of what goes into making software. There's the knowledge of knowing that some things aren't going to make it to release, things are going to break, and it's just how it goes. And they know it'll get done when it gets done, but it's going to get done right, rather than working for bigger companies that are just all about that bottom line and try to get stuff out as fast as you can. They don't care about tech debt. They don't care about the code. They just care about selling whatever they need to sell on the internet, and you are just a means to an end for them. And I don't know where I was going with that, but I guess what I was trying to say was that I understand what it's like to not be at a place that appreciates developers and lets you grow, and then working at somewhere. And I'm not saying that your startup was like that. I'm just saying that working somewhere where they value you for your skill and for your trade and what you do, and they want you to grow, and they want to give you the tools that you need to grow into positions and become a better developer, because they want to keep you around, because they want you to be happy. And that's something that was really lacking at my first job, and I have now, which is really nice. And I don't know if you've been working at Amazon for a short while now, but I'm assuming that they give you the proper tools that you need to be in a good spot and be a happy developer, right? Because it's hard to find happy developers that have been at the same place for a long time. So
yeah, I mean, it means growing pains, right? For any startups, I think that's one thing that you probably were like alluding to beyond just like financially being stable. Is like, how do you scale your 20-person company into 200 after a few years, right? So I mean, it is what it is, and I learned a lot, and
that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. Anything else you want to talk about Amazon? I'm sorry, because I realized that like I brought it up and then we talked about it so briefly that we didn't really get into any of the meat of it. So
no, I mean, I want to do it for you because
dude, it's 1 a.m. where you're at. Like I'm just happy that you were able to make it at this time. I tell everybody that I try to do live streams with. I'm going to be doing coding after 30 next week on Thursday. I think is what we're going to shoot for it. But like my schedule's crazy, and I can't like right now at 8:30. I did it a little early to not like take you over so long. Like my wife took the kids in the other room with their tablets and put their headphones on and was like, shh, dad's doing a live stream or whatever. So it's really hard for me to like record with other people, because I always have to record at like just obscure time. So I appreciate you coming out and like doing this. So I want to make sure that you're able to like talk about whatever you want to talk about as well.
No, I mean, we always think you never know how you're going to feel at that time, right? But after talking to you and just getting that energy, I actually feel a little more awake, which is a good sign. And
nice.
Yeah, like maybe we can answer a few questions and then.
Let's do that. Let's wrap it up because we are over an hour right now. I know that there was a couple questions early on, so I'm going to check the chat real quick to make sure I don't miss anyone. I'm hello to everyone who dropped by. Sorry if I wasn't paying attention to the chat. Let me see. I don't know what that is.
Hey, you're getting coding after 30 is here.
I'm looking forward to interviewing him too. Let's see. Can you guys talk about soft skills? That he had a question about that. Can you guys talk about soft skills in coding? You mentioned that you felt that some of your soft skills were lacking a bit during your interview process. What do you feel are some soft skills that developers should have, or should assume that they're going to need to learn these things or get used to these things when they're going into it, because it's not all just code all the time?
I think I've changed a lot since I first started coding to where I am now, and I kind of developed this really bad habit of thinking that code is the truth. And what I mean by that is, as long as I'm right with the code, I can act however I want.
It's spoken like a true senior level developer. Right
no,
there.
this is what I learned from my senior developer back in my agency. It just seemed like he was getting so much respect because he could act like, I mean, just whatever he wants, because he was so brilliant and smart. And then I kind of carried that over to my startup, and it can get you so far, but at a certain point, people just don't want to deal with you, right?
Yeah.
So I think what I really learned throughout my whole coding process is don't talk to people like how you treat your code in some regards, as a bunch of binary if statements, and some people, they may not code the same way that you do, and you're not gonna be like, hey, are you so this is obviously wrong, but you can't just say, no, you're wrong. There are ways where I've learned to just kind of cushion the blow to my junior developers when I'm pairing with them. Like, okay, that's a really good approach, but have you ever considered why you're doing this part? Or can you explain to me why you're doing this? And rather than just telling them they're wrong and then just fixing it, which is what the person did to me, I've learned to just be a better mentor essentially through my soft skills. And being able to communicate that in a better fashion has really helped me in the long run. And I think that kind of definitely helped me shine during my interviews, right? Even the ones that I didn't pass, I would argue that a lot of them, they're really kind of saying hey, we really love talking to you, and we really loved like getting to know you, but there was some other stuff, right? So I think it was just one of those things where they were definitely on the fence and weren't sure, but my soft skills definitely helped in that regard.
Yeah. I am lucky that I have worked so many customer service and like service industry jobs that like my whole life has been, trying to make small talk with people who I'm parking their cars or I'm waiting tables, and I'm just, trying to be nice to them until they like give me some money and they go away, right? Because that was what
oh man, if I got paid for every time I was holding my tongue, I would have been rich.
Yeah. So you kind of learn how to interact with people, right. and you learn customer service in that sense. And I feel that those skills that I learned from customer service really helped when it comes to like what you said is just kind of getting your point across without sounding like an asshole, right? Because if you have a customer who's completely wrong, and they're just beyond wrong, you can't sit there and be like, dude, you're dumb, you don't know what you're talking about. No, you have to take it and you have to explain to them that, yes, we understand that you're upset, but this is how it is, and you're the customer, and I'm talking to you nicely because you're the customer, and you kind of grow that as a skill. And then, like you said, right, when you have to explain to someone like, hey, you're doing this wrong, you don't want to go in there and be like, your code sucks, scrap that, write this, push that shit, right? You're not gonna be like that. You're gonna be more like how you said, a good mentor. Speak to people, explain things to them, and by doing that, like I feel like that kind of crossed over a little bit with my skills from other jobs that were unrelated to code. And like just talking to people, you don't realize that you're going to talk to more people than you think when you become a programmer. And when you have to deal with business and making sure that you get what they want done, because ultimately at the end of the day, doesn't matter how good your code is, if business doesn't want a certain thing done, or if they want something done a certain way, you're more than likely going to have to, unless it's completely bad and going to create all kinds of bugs or something that you should just not do, more than likely you're going to implement what business wants you to do. So being able to communicate with people and talk is definitely a soft skill that goes a long way, I think, for anything. Rusty asked, how much CSS do you have to know to get a job? I feel that that's I'll let Alex answer first before I give my response on that. Since you're the guest, I want you to answer these questions.
I mean, my first job, I didn't know that much CSS because I came out of a coding bootcamp and learned Ruby on Rails. But the second one, I think, so I have to preface this by when I was working at an agency, one of my projects was doing only CSS and Sass on a project that was completely built out, but no styling was done. And that was the first time and only time I've ever seen some company just build a project with no CSS. So it was literally just a white screen with input fields unstyled and bullet unordered list and everything. It was so crazy to me that a full-fledged application could be working like this. But basically, I was on a 1.5-month project of just pure Sass and CSS, and I got really good because imagine just doing this CSS for that long and nothing else. So I would say my front end skills were definitely amplified, and my employer definitely loved that I knew my CSS and I knew how to build scalable CSS for that matter. And I liked it. Yeah, it made me a better developer. I would highly recommend anyone that is trying to focus on front end. If you're good at it, get good at CSS if you can.
Yeah, it definitely goes a long way. But you said one thing that's very important: scalable.
Yeah,
CSS. When you're building a single, one-page portfolio, or a 3-page website, I've seen how bad CSS can get. I have written some bad CSS. So quick story time, right? At my first job, once we got this project to do, I probably had about a year of experience in at that time, and we got like a revamp of the home page, right? And it was basically, we were starting a fresh site. We were getting, brand new designs, and I had to implement it in CSS. I asked management multiple times. They had us, the three of us, as the core team from our team that were in-house employees, and they gave us 3 or 4 contractors from an agency. And from the beginning, I was like, I need a senior level front end developer. Right. I am not qualified to do this. Okay, yeah, we'll get them for you. I'm like, no, like you guys are starting this already. Like we should have had this guy before the designs got started. Like we need him. Like I can make it look good, but I'm not gonna do this correctly. And I knew that I tried to learn. I tried to do the best that I could. But even at talking to my buddy afterwards that still worked there, he's like, yeah, man, you made a mess in there. I was like, I know, dude. I told them they didn't want to listen to me. But now I've learned a little bit more about that. And the developer who's basically my predecessor at the job where I'm at now, who did a lot of the framework that we have, and he did a lot of the SaaS in there. Man, it's a thing of beauty, like how he did everything. It just shows you what somebody with experience doing scalable CSS versus me with 1 year experience being thrown in to set up CSS for a brand new project. It's night and day. And yeah, it takes a lot to learn good CSS or to be good at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just very underrated. It's very underrated in our industry to build scalable CSS, because people think like they glamorize the JavaScript, they glamorize everything else, but you'll be surprised how much crazy CSS people write just to move like a button to the side because they don't know what they're doing. So
it's pretty nuts. And you're right. And CSS you mess it up, you can cause the world's biggest nightmare if you have a bunch of bad CSS in a project where you start getting all that code smell where it's like, why are there so many importance in this?
Why are there so many importance? Why is the Z index like 999 versus 999?
9 billion. Yeah. It's
it's insane.
Little things like that stand out as code smell that a junior dev just wouldn't notice, that comes with some time and understanding. And CSS, it's very underrated skill. And I'd say as much as you can to answer your question, learn as much CSS as you can. There's no exact amount. There's people who have been writing CSS for years who are like gods at it, and you don't need to be at that level to get a job, but you need to understand it. Here's a question for you. What are things that Fang versus startup do differently when it comes to problem solving specifically? Is there any process that they kind of do at Amazon that's different when it comes to like solutionizing problems or whiteboarding stuff or discussing how you guys can implement certain things or whatnot?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I can talk about the nitty-gritty details, but there is a lot more attention to detail at Amazon before you start the work. And I think that's just the nature of like your business, and you're dealing with a lot of customers and all of those things. So I think there's a lot more discussion and review by the developers, and they actually care. So they're asking you these really hard questions that you might not consider. But I mean, at least at my startups and the agency, it was just like, just do it. Like,
just do it. Yep.
Build a feature and we'll worry about it. Don't even think about
your problem to deal with.
The implication of potentially exposing something. It's just kind of just start the work. And in some regards, it was good for me when I was starting off as a developer to just just do it, because I wasn't even good at coding. But now that I'm decent at it, it's good to think about all the other things I never thought about before I started a project. And I think that's the differentiation from what I can
design patterns and architecture and database architecture. It's all stuff that kind of on the same, it's very similar. It's funny because your startup and your agency work is so similar to what my experience was at my first job, because they treated us very much like that. And now at my current job, it's like you said, there's meetings, and the meetings are all, I honestly don't have any like dumb pointless meetings. Like we have real meetings that we discuss planning, we discuss implementation of certain features and how they can affect other things and things that we need to consider, like you were talking about. And we don't have those dumb meetings where it's just like, who's the highest paid person in this room that wants to talk. We have meetings where we actually solve problems and we focus on building good code. And I didn't have that at my first job. And for you to kind of like mention that, not to say that you guys didn't plan good meetings and stuff like that at your startup, but I have seen that myself, where how some companies, or at least teams that know what they're doing when it comes to like building code that you're going to have to maintain for years and years and years to come, treat their projects versus teams that are just like, we're going to redo the homepage, go get it done. And then it's like, you want us to do this in a month and a half? Like, how do we can't? This is like a 6-month project. oh, well, we're going to see how we get it done in a month and a half then, right?
Right.
It's
I
just,
mean, I think it's just the amount of, I don't want to sound like elitist about this, but it's just I've noticed that a lot of questions are asked where in at least at Fang, where it's like, oh, I didn't think about those things, or oh, I didn't think about those things. But at my startups and even my agency, I was creating the documentation or doing the presentation to explain to them what I'm actually doing, not necessarily like, do you have anything to add to this conversation, or am I just explaining to you what I'm going to be doing, right? So it's a different motivation on why you're presenting what you're presenting before you start.
yeah.
Like at least with Fang, I noticed that it's more along the lines of contributing to um, the project in a sense of, have you thought about this or have you thought about this, versus the other time at my startups and agency, it was just more like, I'm going to be doing this. And they're like, oh, okay. It's like, why did I waste my time writing this document and presentation if that's all you're going to do? Yeah.
Buddy. I was looking at this question. It says, I've seen a lot of advice for beginners to aim for freelancing ASAP after free courses instead of joining a coding bootcamp. How do you feel about this kind of approach? I guess I'm a little confused about the question. It seems I'm going to assume that, or do you want to start freelancing, or if you're looking into joining a boot camp after you do some free courses, I would say try some free stuff online first, or even some paid courses that aren't like, an arm and a leg, and see how it goes before you consider going to boot camp. Give it a try. You don't have to necessarily freelance, but I would say build some projects and try to see how far you can get before you consider committing to a boot camp. Coming from a self-taught perspective, that's the approach I would take. Because honestly, you might hate it after a month, or you might love it and be like, I can do this all day and I don't need to go to a boot camp because I do this for fun. And then if you want to freelance and try to make a little money while you learn before you go get a job, do it. I wish I would have freelanced more, honestly. And I feel like I answered that weird because I think it was questioned or formatted a little strange. So I tried to answer it as best as I could. I'm trying to find another question here.
Well, I do have one input actually though on that. I think one thing I would do differently now, that I didn't do then, was I would probably learn a lot more about coding before I attended the coding bootcamp school, because of the potential like watered down thing that you're talking about. It's like now there's more expectation that you have to learn how to learn better. So if I was me now in 2021, I would probably take at least 1 or 2 Udemy courses before I attend the coding boot. And if I'm able to get a job, I wouldn't attend the coding bootcamp. But if I just feel like I need that extra attention or something, then I think that's when I would do the coding bootcamp. But like you said, I would even as a coding bootcamp graduate, I would recommend doing the self-taught route first. See if you like it and see if you could get a job. And if you can't, then that's when you start exploring other options. And I think that's generally my advice for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I say, give it like a while too. Don't try to learn for like a week or two and think that you've actually like put enough time to try to learn. Like I feel like I wasn't even retaining anything for the first 3 months, and there was a lot of fumbling around and lack of guidance on my part. But I still spent every single day watching videos, trying to build stuff, or trying to follow along with tutorials and trying to learn whatever I could. And it took months before I even felt comfortable enough to do a static HTML page on my own, with some CSS. So it takes time. And then once you feel like, if you've been at it for like a year and you really think a bootcamp is your best option to get placed, I just would say make sure you've tried to apply a bunch before you go to that bootcamp, because you could be ready for a job and not know it. So this question, I'm just trying to see, there's not actually a whole bunch of questions, and I think I maybe missed some. I can answer this question because I did some of the Odin project, and I have a video about the Odin project that I kind of go over foundations and then the JavaScript and the Ruby on Rails stuff. After the foundations section, it just really depends on what you're trying to do. I personally wouldn't recommend the Ruby on Rails. I would recommend their full stack JavaScript curriculum, but you could also deviate to going into a different, learning platform that will teach you JavaScript or things after that. But if you're enjoying the Odin project, I would personally go JavaScript full stack rather than the Ruby full stack, just because the demand for Node and React and all that is so much higher than Ruby on Rails at the time, unless you're like in Europe, right? Europe's still pretty good job market for Rails, right?
I don't know.
You don't know. Come on, did you go to a bootcamp for Ruby?
Yeah, but I don't use it anymore. Funny enough.
So would you say, if you had to learn between the two on Odin project, Ruby on Rails or full stack JavaScript, which one would you go?
I'll do JavaScript. And the reason why is it's just you're gonna have to know JavaScript anyways. So might as well just kind of stick with one language, get good at it, and then just adapt accordingly. If you get a job with Ruby on Rails or Ruby, then good for you. You know, like you can, as long as you learn one language, you could kind of go, okay, I know how to do this in JavaScript. How do I do this in Ruby, or how do I do this in Go? And you just translate accordingly.
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to wrap it up. I want to say one thing before we do. You mentioned something about like the more money thing, and I know I made a video talking about like it's okay to learn how to code for the money. Like I know a lot of people, you know, there's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on in like programming, that it's like you gotta be passionate about this. It's this has to run through your veins in order for you to do this, and it's not true. It's at the end of the day, it's a skill, it's a trade, it's a job, it's something you learn, it's something that you can do for work and get paid for it, and then go home and have a life and have hobbies. And it doesn't have to be all about code. You don't have to, you know, live, breathe, eat, sleep, and all this stuff code. You can just learn this stuff, apply it for what you want it to do, which most people want to make more money with it, and do that. It's okay. And I wanted to say that because I heard you say, like, you know, you kept moving for the more money and you wanted to, you know, that was one of the big motivators for you with a lot of things with coding, and it's okay for you to want to make money by learning how to code. And so many people don't talk about that enough. Like,
yeah, I mean, I have to admit, like, I might have, even in some of my videos, I talk about like having to love it and enjoy it kind of thing. And maybe it was one of those things where you can't just casually do it, if you know what I mean. And if you're going to be obsessed about something, there has to be some kind of enjoyment behind it, was what I was trying to allude to. But I think it's more often than not, people don't even know if they enjoy it, and then they want to do it purely for the money. I think there has to be that right balance between like validating that you do deserve this amount based on your skills, but at the same time, if you don't enjoy it, man, I personally don't want to be reading documentation hours and hours, or pressing my build and waiting and then seeing it fail and then there has to be some kind of enjoyment or love for it. But yeah, you're right. Like you don't have to just be like live, eat, breathe code. It's there has to be a good balance for sure.
Yeah, enjoying it makes it a lot easier for you to stay on track. Well, Alex, TechRally, everyone, make sure his channel is in the description. Make sure you check him out, subscribe, show him some love over there. He's got a lot of good stuff. He's putting out great content. Appreciate everyone coming out here. Thank you, Alex, for coming out and doing this. I know it's super late, and I want to let you get to bed. It's like 1 a.m. right now in New York, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I really do. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dorian. And I love your channel, first of all. I mean, you've blown up in the past year, and deservedly so.
Crazy.
I mean, I know the type of work you put in, and just, yeah, your goals, man. You're like my senior developer of YouTube that I'm like reaching for. So, I mean, I'm definitely taking notes on what you're doing, and I'm going to see if I could eventually surpass you one day. Just kidding.
Hey, hopefully, man. I want everybody to do good. I honestly, if I had any advice, I wish I could give it to you, but I have no idea how I did it. I swear to God, I just looked up like as much SEO stuff as I could and learning how to code stuff, and I just made videos on topics that I thought people might want to hear about that I couldn't do SEO on, and I got lucky with a couple of videos that did well. I wish I could give you the magic formula for it, but I really don't know. Oh, man, snap! Quincy Larson's in here, everyone. That's pretty cool. It's always fun to see him pop up in the live stream.
And the senior developer or YouTubers are hoarding the information. Me and Coding After 30 have to find the secrets. But really, thanks for having me on, and I really appreciate it as well.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for coming on. All right, everybody. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone.